It seems that there's some leaked datasheets doing the rounds for Imperial Knights. If they're to be believed, we've got damage -1, a massive harpoon that does 10 mortal wounds, and some vast improvements for just about every single gun. Let's take a good look. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Imperial Knights, and no sooner do Games Workshop announce that there's a codex coming, than we see a whole bunch of potential leaked datasheets online, appearing to be in a similar kind of style to the ones that we had for Tyranids and Eldar, which if they're real are quite likely from a playtester's copy of the codex. Compared with the last set of leaks, there is a little bit more debate as to whether or not these ones are real or whether or not they've been very intensively faked. From my point of view, I think all of the rules look like they're very believable for what Games Workshop might release for Knights. They seem really typical of the buffs that they've been giving Lords of War, weapon profiles, and a lot of the rules make sense when taken in context of each other. Most of the formatting on the datasheets appears to check out to me. There are just a few unusual discrepancies, things like some wording that looks like it might have been copy-pasted from the previous codex, and they don't appear to have the little unit profile pictures next to them either, which the Eldar and Tyranid ones all did. Still though, it's really not impossible this could be an earlier version of a playtester codex, so I'm genuinely kind of on the fence as to whether or not these are real. I really wouldn't be surprised if they turned out to be, but then I wouldn't be too surprised if they just turned out to be a really labour-intensive fake. I guess you guys can make your own minds up. In any case, I do feel like it'd be good fun to look through, potentially getting a glimpse of what the Knight Codex might have in store. We've got 3 of these potential leaked datasheets, one for the Castellan, one for the Valiant, and one for the Armiger Warglaives. First up for the Knight Castellan, it appears that if this is indeed the leaked datasheet, its power levels increasing to 38, which would very likely reflect a points bump to around about 760, so significantly more than the 600 plus that it is at the moment. The statline buffs do seem quite in keeping with what they like to do in 9th edition, a bit more movement, hitting on 2+ ballistic skill, might make sense for a dedicated ranged knight I guess, plus 4 wounds to 32, leadership 10 and a 2+ save. As well as that, the Ion Shield appears to work in melee now, as it just gives you a 5+ invul save, not just against ranged attacks, and Imperial Knights appear to be picking up an extra special rule which is Sanctified Bulwark, basically -1 damage. That one does seem perfectly plausible when you look at the Eldar Wraith Knight who picked up the same thing. Taken together, they make Imperial Knights significantly tougher to take out unless you've got really high AP, high damage weapons, and it does seem very similar to the sort of stats buffs that we saw, say, in the new Tyranid Codex. Similarly, the gun profiles all appear to have been quite heavily buffed as well. The Plasma Decimator now with damage 3 or 4 depending on whether you overcharge. It'd be up from damage 1 or 2 previously, though almost everyone took Call's Wrath to give it a damage 3 if you overcharged. It does appear to have lost 12 inches worth of range though, which will kind of be in keeping with other plasma weapons through the game. The Volcano Lance has 2d3 shots, a slight increase on d6 before, and the damage characteristic has gone from 3d3 to d3+6, a modest increase on the amount of damage it had put out, that'd be an average from 8 up from 6. It does appear to have lost its bonus reroll against Titanic targets, so it is kind of a side grade if you're firing against say Knights or Storm Surges, but a bit better against everything else. Finally, for its secondary weapons, the Shieldbreaker missiles are just a little bit more vicious, up to strength 12, AP -6, and damage d3+3. They were already quite nasty already though, and still cut straight through invuls. It doesn't appear that there's any restriction on launching one of them at a time anymore, so I guess in theory, if you had a Castellan loaded out with 4 of these, you could fire them all off as a pretty devastating alpha strike against something with a good invul save. Finally, the Siegebreaker cannons are strength 8 and AP -2. That'd definitely be a lot nastier against a lot of vehicle targets, and particularly anything like 2-wound Space Marines. In melee, it does kind of reflect the rumoured change to Imperial Knights, that they weren't going to be getting multiple attacks from their stompy feet anymore. Instead, it just appears that they might have a higher base attacks, up to attack 6, which actually hit fairly hard with those, strength 8, AP -3 and damage 4. That kind of does feel a bit more appropriate for Imperial Knights to be honest. They're not going to have many attacks, they're not going to step on all that many troops as they're fairly unwieldy, but if you do have an entire Imperial Knight step on you, you really are going to feel it. Finally, it appears that they've picked up a special rule called Battlefield Dominion. It means that if the Castellan is within 6 inches of enemy troops, then it cancels their objective secured abilities. Again, this does kind of feel in keeping with the Castellan's intended role, a big centerpiece to put at the back of your army, laying down firepower and keeping a home objective safe, and it would mean that you'd likely actually have to kill the Castellan if you did want to sneak away with the objective that it was standing on. Really quite a powerful rule for knights that. I'm sure that's likely to combine with its towering foe rule, the one that we already know that it gets, counting as 10 models for the purposes of standing on objectives and things. Otherwise, I think it's quite interesting that they've simplified the explosion rules. The dual core explosion now just goes off on a flat 4+, no rolling multiple dice, and if it does explode, it looks particularly vicious, getting d6 mortal wounds on every unit within 12 inches, which is pretty horrendous. You'd certainly worry if this sort of thing was going to explode in the middle of your army, and it wouldn't be a great thing for it to explode in your enemy's one. Overall, it does look like absolutely massive stat buffs on both the defensive and the offensive side, accompanied with a fair points bump as well. Overall, it looks a lot stronger, and to me, the stat changes do seem very believable for what they might do for Imperial Knights in 9th edition. I guess we'll have to wait and see if it turns out to be accurate. Just for fun, here's a little bit of damage output for the Castellan. This one assumes it's hitting on 2s at the ballistic skill, and the melter guns aren't in range because it's too far away. Your 760 point model will kill around about 11 dead Space Marines, do an absolutely colossal amount of damage to toughness 7 vehicles with a 3+ save, in theory about 44 wounds in total, but in reality it's always going to be a fair bit less than that. The Volcano Lance averages 22 wounds of that, and there's almost no toughness 7 vehicles that have that many wounds, likely meaning that you're going to get a whole ton of overkill. Still though, it could easily take out 2 very big threats with each of its primary weapons, and a fair bit of damage from its secondary ones. Even if you're targeting something that's very hard to take out, maybe a toughness 8 vehicle with a 3+ save, 5+ invul and -1 damage like a Plague Burst Crawler or an Eldar Wraith Knight, you'd still be expecting something like 21 wounds on the thing. Again, that does kind of feel in keeping with what you'd hope for from a 760 point model that's dedicated to be mainly anti-tank, fairly guaranteed to do some very vicious damage. Moving on, we also have this potential leak sheet for the Knight Valiant. Again, it looks like it's power 38 or around 760 points. Interestingly, the stat line is very slightly different to the Castellan's in that it hits on weapon skill 2+, so weirdly is abnormally nasty with its stompy feet, maybe befitting it more as a close range knight as opposed to the Castellan that really wants to be standing at the back and not engaging in combat. The majority of the knight rules seem fairly similar, but the interesting one is that it gets a rule called Adamantium Flame, which means that it ignores the result of a Dominus Malfunction roll, something that doesn't exist yet for the Imperial Knights, but presumably could be some sort of damage roll that you take when your knight degrades, and maybe something that the other knights take but this guy doesn't. To be honest, this one really seems like there has been some good thought put behind this, and it could be another reason to believe that the datasheets are real a bit more, as it would tie in quite well with the Knight Valiant having 3 sets of degrading stats, but the Knight Castellan only having 2 sets. The Knight Castellan's ballistic skill doesn't degrade at all, unlike just about every other gun platform in 9th edition, and if you were going to fake a datasheet to this kind of level, I'd just be very surprised if you didn't give it a degrading ballistic skill, as that seems like a really obvious oversight. If these do turn out to be real, it sounds like instead of having a 3rd set of degrading stats, then it sounds like when the knight degrades, the Castellan might well have to roll on this table. It might mean various different bits of the knight fall off, either losing a bit of ballistic skill, maybe even losing its ion shield or a saving throw, or maybe having some of its weapons put out of action. I feel like with a lot of vehicles, having the 7th edition and earlier vehicle damage tables can be a bit clunky, but it really is something that could be quite easy to realise on Imperial Knights. It could feel really quite cinematic to have bits of your knight shot off, maybe taking a bit of a leaf out of things like Adeptus Titanicus perhaps. Otherwise though, the Valiant really does have some pretty exciting guns. The Conflagration Cannon seems to have a bit of a side grade. Its strength is decreased from strength 7 to strength 6, but it gains an extra d3 shots, and it is AP -3 rather than 2. It's going to be a fair bit worse against a fair few toughness 7 targets, but against things like Space Marines it'll be even more spicy, potentially killing 7 or 8 of them in a single gout of fire. The Thunder Coil Harpoon though I think is where the real excitement is at. Like before, it only gets the 1 shot. Previously it had a damage characteristic of 10, and it was actually depressingly likely to fail to either hit or wound, or just ping off an invul save. But now if these stats are to be believed, if you hit and wound, which is usually going to be on a 2+, you deal 10 mortal wounds to the target, and enemy units within 3 inches also take 3 mortal wounds as well. Obviously that's completely crazy sounding stats, you're going to be just as happy wiping out enemy infantry units as vehicles here, but to be honest, considering that this thing only has a 12-inch range, and still has at least a fairly reasonable chance of failing to either hit or wound, I think that does sound like kind of fairly believable damage output on a 700+ point model. The old Thundercoil was really good fun, but it was kind of underwhelming and very depressingly prone to failure. In a world of Tau railguns, when this thing has such a limited range, it just really doesn't seem that crazy by 9th edition standards. Looks like it'd be a crazy fun gun to fire though, even if your opponent would have a fair bit of counterplay to it, spreading out units and potentially measuring out threat ranges very carefully to make sure that it couldn't quite target the things that it most needed to. Finally, I do find its melee quite interesting. Hitting on 2s with 6 attacks at strength 8 and damage 4 would actually make it a fairly decent threat against medium infantry and things, something that the Valiant's always been very bad at before, despite in theory being a knight that you want to charge towards the opponent. It'd certainly help it out a fair bit anyway. Finally, we've got a sheet for the Armiger Warglaives, which appear to be power level 10, which would mean a massive points increase, going up to around about 200 points each. Currently they're only 135, so they're really cheap to field. If this thing is to be believed, it would likely be getting almost 50% more expensive, which is pretty mad. In compensation, it does appear to be getting some very nice stat line boosts, up to a 16-inch move just in case your previous 14 wasn't enough, hitting on 2s in combat, strength 7, a big 16 wounds, 8 attacks, and a 2+ armor save. Very mighty stat line increases there, but again, taken in context of a 50% points increase, I think it'd be interesting to weigh up whether or not it actually turns out being better if these datasheets are accurate. Otherwise, it does appear that Armigers might have some very different special rules to the main knights. It looks like they're a single squadron of vehicles without splitting now, unless that rule has been condensed into something like the Oathbound Phalanx rule, which we don't have the rules for. My guess is that will be where the rule would be. As to me, it would feel really quite clunky to have a big unit of more than one 200-point model in it, and not have them able to go their separate ways to take down different threats. It appears that the Armigers get the -1 damage as well. Maybe not too unexpected, considering things like Space Marine Dreadnoughts and Eldar Wraith Knights get it. Interestingly, it seems that their Ion Shield has been altered, no longer getting an invul save against range whatsoever, but getting one at 4+ in melee. Really means they could be significantly easier to take out at range than in combat. And also, in what appears to be a unique Armiger Warglaive special rule, they get +2 inches to their charge and a bonus movement to pile in and consolidate. The +2 inch charge could be really handy if you did want to put one of these in strategic reserve, for example. It could mean that they're quite reliable to get into combat against something on the battlefield edge. Finally, much like the other weapon datasheets, it does appear that the weapons are getting a buff as well. The Thermal Spear getting it to a flat Assault 3 weapon rather than D3 as it is at the moment, and the damage output getting a bit less random. Strength 8, AP -4 and flat damage 4, going up to flat damage 6 if it's within half range. Interestingly though, the range does seem to have got a bit of a debuff, going down to 24 inches. The Chain Cleaver looks like it could still be the thing to fear though. Rather than 4 attacks at strength 14, AP -3 and damage 3, it'll now be striking at strength 9, AP -2 and damage 2, but getting a very meaty 8 attacks to make up for it, making it a lot better against killing light infantry than going after heavy targets. Hitting on 2+ will also help it quite a bit, as it previously hit on 3s. Maybe the really impressive potential profile, though, is its sweep attack that it gets. In theory, that'd be striking at a crazy 24 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 7, AP -1 and damage 1, making it pretty much an ultimate horde clearer. I'll be honest, I might have thought that was quite excessive before I saw the Tyranid datasheet leaks. If you compare this to, say, the Tyranid Morlock, though, that thing's got kind of a similar profile. That one strikes at 16 attacks at strength 7, AP -1, and that one's only a 125-point model. Seeing as this guy's actually supposed to be a dedicated melee unit, and it's all the way up to 200 points, that maybe really doesn't surprise me that it's a very good horde clearer, which knights have often had a bit of trouble with, having relatively few models on the table. I would theorise as well that this could be a small mirror to whatever the main profile on the big Reaper chainsword turns out to be, the one that's present on the Questoris Knights. I'm going to guess that if the stomping feet are changing to that previous profile, then that would have a strike attack and sweep attack, where you get multiple attacks per attack on your profile. Overall though, it certainly looks solid. I think that the Armiger Warglaive is maybe just a little bit less obviously automatically better though. All the buffs are massively stronger, but seeing as it's going to be costing a massive amount more points than it was before, I feel like it might potentially even out somewhat. Probably a buff on the whole, but you're going to be fielding massively less of these than you were able to before. So anyway, some really interesting stuff there. Let me know what you think of the Knight datasheets down in the comments below. As to whether or not they're legit, I'm really on the fence for these. The actual rules themselves seem really quite believable to me for something that Games Workshop would come out with. Interesting that it hints at inbuilt weaknesses in the Knights as well with the damage table, which is something that I could easily see them doing, and the weapons stat lines and special rules all seem very plausible for what they'd come out with 9th edition datasheets. My current guess is that they'd probably be real and an early version of the playtester codex, but if they turn out to be fake, then absolutely hats off to the people who made them. They must have put a fairly serious amount of effort and thought into them. The formatting looks largely very believable, and all the rules look pretty much as I'd expect for a 9th edition Knights Codex. Anyway, let me know what you think down in the comments below, or if you have any further information on their legitimacy. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k things coming, with new videos out every day, and I'll certainly cover any more news of the Imperial Knights to come if we get any more leaks, rules, or any details about the new codex. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention one way in which you can help support, and that's the Auspex Tactics Patreon page down in the comments below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.